"You believe this? I'm calm as hell, but one wrong move and this bullet flies. I'm a cop. Right or wrong, I'm always right," Officer Nathan Morton snarled, gun aimed straight at a black man's chest. He thought he had control, thought every black face was a suspect, worth the risk. But he had no idea he was pointing a gun at Malchus Carter, a black FBI agent ready to tear down his sick, racist fantasy of power. "What state are you in, and if this happened there, would you speak up?" Watch till the end to see what happens when justice stares down the barrel and doesn't flinch. The midday sun beat down on the oil-streaked concrete of the Hapacall supermarket parking lot. A light shimmer of heat rose from the pavement. In that sweltering space, Malchus Carter was leaning over, packing a few grocery bags into the trunk of a silver SUV. Dressed in a dark shirt and khaki pants, his movements were calm, no different from any other shopper finishing their errands. A patrol car suddenly screeched to a halt just a few meters away. The door flew open. Officer Morton stepped out, tall, crisp in his uniform, but his eyes sharpened with suspicion. His hand already rested on his holster as he strode toward Malchus with an uncontrolled urgency. "Hands up," Morton barked, glancing quickly at the still-open trunk. "I received a report about a suspicious exchange in this area." Malchus looked up, frowning slightly. Without surprise, he tilted his head and replied evenly, "What report? What did you see?" Morton didn't answer. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing with scorn. "I've arrested plenty like you. They all pretend to be polite at first," he sneered, voice laced with contempt. The remark echoed through the hushed parking lot, making a woman pushing a stroller pause and turn her head. Malchus didn't retreat, nor did he move forward. Raising his left hand gently, he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket to retrieve a leather wallet. "I'm not a suspect, you're making a mistake," he said in a neutral tone. But as soon as the wallet emerged, Morton shouted, "Hands off! Drop it now!" The yell startled nearby shoppers, and phones began recording. In a flash, Morton had his pistol drawn, the dark muzzle aimed squarely at Malchus's head. No one spoke. Time seemed frozen. It happened in seconds, but the moment stretched, heavy with the threat of violence. Malchus stayed still, hands raised, the wallet falling to the ground. "I want to speak to your superior," he said, eyes locked on Morton. "I won't do anything, but you're crossing the line," Morton's voice cracked. "You're a black man transporting drugs. You think if I shoot you, anything will happen? You think this bullet won't just accidentally go off if you twitch?" His words, thick with hostility, left the crowd breathless. "I'm the cop. Whether it's right or wrong, I'm always right." The tension reached a point where any movement could be taken as provocation. A middle-aged man near the store entrance quietly stepped back and discreetly filmed the patrol car's license plate. The air turned thick. Morton still held the gun, but his hand began to tremble. Malchus didn't flinch or raise his voice, his eyes calm in a way that defied logic. He knew one wrong move could trigger a bullet with no warning. The silence stretched taut like a steel wire. More people gathered. Some made calls, others simply watched. No one intervened. "I'm trying to keep this within bounds," Malchus said in a low but clear voice. "But you just aimed a gun at the law without realizing it." It wasn't a threat, but an indictment. He didn't need to shout or make grand gestures. His composure alone pushed Morton toward a line he could no longer defend. Not far away, a phone rang. The person answering was Police Chief Dan Carter. A quiet police vehicle slid into a nearby parking space. The door opened. Dan Carter stepped out, uniform crisp under the glaring sun. His face showed tension, but his steps were firm. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a narrow path through the heavy atmosphere. Malchus stood still, hands still raised, eyes locking with Dan's. No words were needed. They both understood the weight of this silence. Morton turned, his expression twitching as he saw Dan. Still pointing the gun, he said shakily, "He looks suspicious. I thought there might be an illegal exchange." Dan stepped forward, his gaze ice-cold. "You just aimed a weapon at a federal agent. That's enough to trigger an immediate investigation." Morton didn't lower the weapon. "I didn't know he was FBI," he stammered. Dan remained still. "Because you never let him speak." The air froze again. Phones continued recording. A child cried in the distance. A woman covered her child's ears and pulled him away from the gathering. Dan looked around and gestured to a man filming nearby. You, keep that footage. We'll need it as evidence." Then he turned to an elderly woman near a cart. "Would you be willing to testify if needed?" She nodded, still staring at Morton, as if unable to grasp what was happening. Dan didn't wait. He straightened his back and announced, voice steady and clear across the lot, "I'm Dan Carter, Chief of Police. As of this moment, I'm suspending Officer Nathan Morton. His badge and weapon will be confiscated immediately." Whispers rippled through the crowd. A child looked up and asked, "Mom, is that man getting fired?" The mother stayed silent, gripping her son's shoulder tightly. Morton froze, disbelief in his eyes. His lips pressed tight before he spoke slowly. "You can't do this. I followed protocol. I was just trying to keep the area safe." Dan met his eyes. "Protocol doesn't let you judge someone by their skin color. Violence needs justification, and you have none except prejudice." Morton pulled the badge from his chest, his knuckles pale from the grip. He placed it, along with the holstered gun, into Dan's hand. Their eyes met once more, one filled with hesitation, the other with resolve. No more words were exchanged. Morton turned and walked back to the patrol car, his face drained of all color. Dan turned back toward Malchus, who was now slowly lowering his arms. He approached, stopping just a step away. "I'm sorry this happened, but maybe it needed to. Sometimes a disruption is the only way to see where the system's gone off course." Malchus gave a faint nod, his eyes not angry, just weighed down by a silent fatigue. They stood there quietly for a few moments, the crowd still unmoving. Above the supermarket, a security camera rotated slowly, capturing everything. Inside Hapakal's internal operations room, an anonymous access was being logged. The data transmitted silently, without alarms, but the person behind it was watching every detail, every face, every decision, every signal that something larger had just begun. That same afternoon, shortly after leaving the police department, Malchus returned to the Hapakal supermarket. Instead of using the main entrance, he followed a narrow utility corridor leading to the security management office. As a federal agent, he had the authority to request surveillance data related to any incident involving potential criminal or official misconduct. A young technician, visibly uneasy at the sight of the FBI badge, guided him into a small room with 3 screens displaying different angles of the parking lot. "You need the footage from the exact moment the incident occurred, right?" the technician asked while typing rapidly on the control panel. "I'll extract a high-quality compressed version with the original audio." Malchus nodded, eyes fixed on the running frames. The primary angle from the west showed the moment Morton pulled out his gun, but something made him pause. The feed jumped directly from Morton stepping out of his car to him already pointing the weapon at Malchus, skipping the entire approach. When he requested a rewind, the same skip occurred. The missing middle segment was inexplicable. The audio was worse. Distorted speech, static interference, entire sections missing. Staying calm, Malchus requested full 3-minute clips from 3 different angles, uncompressed and untouched. He handed over an encrypted USB drive for storing the copy, asking for the extraction time to be recorded and a verification log signed. On the way back, he plugged the device into his personal laptop, equipped with FBI-grade video analysis software. Within 2 minutes, he spotted the irregularity. Each clip had metadata tampered with. The timestamps were synchronized, but the original encoding had been altered. At least 3 spliced points were present, evidence that data from another source had been inserted into the live sequence. Leaning back in his chair, he stared at the screen. Someone had accessed the system before him, with clearance deep enough to edit surveillance footage. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a deliberate operation, executed in haste but with skill. He said nothing, simply opened a secondary hard drive, backed up the original files, encrypted them 3 times, and labeled the folder Red Flag A1. Then he launched a secure messaging platform, typed in the designated identity code, and sent a single message. "Data needs verification. Top priority." The recipient was Logan Pierce, a former DOJ technician who had retired early for personal reasons. Logan had once helped Malchus decrypt a critical file in an internal probe 3 years prior and had once told him, "Some things are meant to be stored, not trusted." After sending the message, Malchus stayed at his desk and re-entered the HAPACall system, using his temporary access code to review the last 24 hours of system logs. The activity log filled quickly, most of it internal, but one entry, time-stamped just minutes before his own visit, stood out. An anonymous ID accessed the system from an external device. The access lasted only 48 seconds and executed one task, extracting video from camera 4 at the exact time of the incident. At the end of the command line, there was a text note, an unusual detail for a standard retail-level security system. It read, "One step late is dangerous." Malchus stepped away from the desk, drew the blinds, checked the lock, then returned to type up a report of his findings. Everything had unfolded too quickly, too quietly, and with too much precision. Morton couldn't have done this alone. The problem wasn't a rogue officer. It was a hidden hand pulling strings behind the scenes. And if evidence was already being altered on day one, whatever Malchus had just initiated was only the beginning of a longer, deeper, and far more dangerous pursuit than any operation he had faced before. Lisa Turner, the security guard on duty at HAPACall that afternoon, hadn't spoken up at first. But during a confidential meeting in Dan Carter's office the next morning, her eyes trembled as she re-watched the clip she had secretly recorded on her phone. Dan reassured her she didn't need to confront anyone, only to confirm what she saw, what everyone saw, but could soon be distorted. She agreed, her voice soft but certain. "I'll testify, if it helps clear his name." An appointment with Internal Affairs was scheduled for the next morning. Lisa left the station in a plain uniform, carrying a backup copy of the clip and a draft statement. That was the last time Dan or Malchus saw her. By midday the next day, Lisa had not shown up. Her phone was unreachable, and the GPS signal had gone dead earlier that morning. A receptionist at Internal Affairs said they waited past the appointment time before calling Dan, assuming she was delayed by traffic. Dan called again. No answer. He contacted the supermarket to check on her status. A coworker from her shift said Lisa had called in with an emergency that morning, but gave no reason. What startled Dan most was that Lisa never came back to retrieve her uniform. That same afternoon, Dan filed an internal report documenting Lisa's unexplained absence. But he didn't stop there. His next call was to Malchus, accompanied by just 5 words: "We have a problem." Without hesitation, Malchus drove to the apartment complex where Lisa lived. Her unit on the second floor was silent. The door was double-locked. Her mailbox overflowed with untouched flyers. Neighbors described her as shy and reserved, not the kind to just disappear. Malchus requested that building management retrieve security camera footage. Luckily, the system retained footage for 7 days and hadn't yet overwritten the files. When they scrolled to the critical window, the video showed Lisa leaving early that morning, wearing a black jacket and carrying a small bag. About 40 minutes later, a black pickup truck parked at the corner. 2 men in maintenance uniforms entered the building's lobby. There was no footage showing them leaving. All subsequent recordings from that hour onward were corrupted, frozen visuals, no audio. At the same time, phone tracking data showed Lisa's device went offline only 2 blocks away. Sitting alone in his car outside the complex, Malchus looked heavy with thought. He activated the FBI's internal terminal on his dashboard, re-entered Lisa's ID, and marked her last contact unconfirmed. As his fingers tapped the keyboard, an old memory surfaced. Another witness, one who had agreed to testify in an internal probe years ago, vanished one day after signing her affidavit. Her body was found 6 months later, ruled a suicide due to psychological stress. The file was closed. No suspect list was ever opened. This time, Malchus recognized the pattern, repeating itself, but more refined, more discreet, and more ruthless. That evening, he entered Dan's office as night fell. On the desk lay a thick envelope, placed neatly without a sender. Dan didn't ask who'd left it. The entire admin wing's cameras had coincidentally suffered a total hard drive failure that day. He opened the envelope, gripping the edge of the paper as if sensing he was about to read something he wasn't meant to know. Inside was a printed photo. Lisa, flanked by 2 men, being forced down a narrow hallway. Her mask was on, her hands clenched around her bag, her eyes wide with fear. Beneath the photo was a hand-cut piece of paper with a neatly inked message: Truth has a price. No signature, no address, no traceable code. Dan laid the photo on the desk, his eyes darkening. Behind him, Malchus stood motionless, like a stone reset at the heart of a system he thought he understood. They both knew this was no longer about disciplining a reckless cop. This was a battle against a network that knew every move they made, and always stayed one step ahead, just enough to make fear seem like the only safe response. After Lisa's photo appeared on his desk, Dan no longer viewed the incident with Morton as an isolated case. Every sign pointed to something that had been pre-designed. That afternoon, during a closed-door meeting, Dan instructed the Internal Affairs Unit to review all personnel and disciplinary records related to Morton. The documents he received 3 hours later were remarkably clean, too clean. Morton was listed as having solid, average performance, with no official reprimands, no demotions, and a nomination for a provisional promotion in his 3rd year. Dan forwarded a copy of the file to Malchus with a brief note. Either he's spotless or someone cleaned it for him. It didn't take long for Malchus to begin his own check. He accessed the internal storage system of the State-Level Oversight Division, which held temporarily removed records not shown in the official archives. After entering Morton's employee ID, the system returned 3 unlinked entries, each marked Restricted Circulation. He opened the first file. It was a handwritten report from Morton's early days on the force, written by a supervisor. The content was short but alarming. Officer Morton used racially offensive language toward a detainee, recommend verbal warning and 3-month monitoring. The second report was more serious. A black man named Thomas Ellison, arrested for a traffic violation, had filed a complaint alleging that Morton beat him in the holding cell. The report described the injuries on the victim's face in detail, yet concluded that there was insufficient basis for action due to temporary camera malfunction. The report was closed after 8 days and omitted from the official records. Malchus leaned back, hands folded, staring at the screen. These records had not disappeared. They had been buried at the right time in the right way by the right people. Access logs showed that all 3 files had been hidden from display by an administrator account 3 months before Dan assumed the role of police chief. The person responsible was the deputy to Dan's predecessor, later promoted to record supervisor. The tampering was obvious, but untouched. Malchus backed up the 3 reports, compiled them into an encrypted file, and stored it on a private internal server with Level 3 access protection. In the accompanying note, he wrote, "Request for independent verification, evidence of serious misconduct concealment." Before leaving his desk, he did something few would. He printed a copy for Dan, sealed it in an envelope, and hand-wrote 1 line on the front. He was warned before. People just stopped saying it. Inside the chief's office, light from the window filtered through heavy curtains, casting shadows across unopened folders stacked on his desk. Dan had just finished a meeting with HR, his mind circling back to one question: who kept Morton in place, and why? When he picked up Malchus's envelope, he knew he was about to touch a submerged part of the system where silence was used as a weapon to protect what shouldn't exist. Among the few present in the parking lot when Morton drew his gun, Officer Oscar Reed was the only one standing nearby who remained silent. After the incident was resolved, he made no statement to the press and offered no internal commentary. But 2 days later, a short internal report bearing Oscar's personal seal appeared on Dan's desk. In it, he detailed what he had witnessed on duty and stated his view of Morton's conduct clearly. The final line, bolded, made Dan pause. He acted as if the law didn't apply to the skin tones he despised. Oscar had always been a careful officer. With nearly a decade in the field, no disciplinary issues, and never known to let emotion cloud judgment. His report wasn't confrontational, it was the truth, stated with integrity. Dan read it 3 times before signing off to send the file to the Inspector Division. He believed that a voice like Oscar's, even if it couldn't change the system yet, was at least a step in the right direction. Less than 2 days later, Oscar was notified of a reassignment to a peripheral unit, a remote patrol station bordering 2 sparsely populated counties. The reason cited was routine quarterly personnel restructuring. Curiously, Oscar was the only one moved during that period. Dan heard about it from the HR secretary and immediately called for a meeting with the department head. The meeting took place in a small conference room. The HR director, a smooth-talking man, placed a reassignment chart in front of Dan and said, "Everything has been approved from the top." When Dan asked who exactly the top referred to, the response came cleanly, "I'm not authorized to disclose that." Dan didn't show anger, but his expression shifted. He recognized that kind of refusal not as a shield for any individual, but as a wall guarding a process long since corrupted. Back in his office, Dan reopened past internal reassignment records from the last 4 years. He underlined 3 names, 3 officers who had once pushed back, questioned, or requested an internal investigation into members labeled politically stable. All 3 had been transferred within a week of filing their reports. Common traits: no public explanation, nameless authorizing entities, and the transferred individuals rarely returned. He stopped at a margin note in one old file, temporarily removed from central office to stabilize department morale. As he closed the final folder, Dan realized Lisa wasn't the first to vanish, and Oscar wouldn't be the last to be pushed out. The system he once believed was broken in individual parts turned out to be functioning exactly as designed, protecting what must be protected, erasing what must be erased, and expelling anyone who dared stand in between. That evening, Dan opened his internal mailbox. A single encrypted message with no sender address appeared. Its content was brief. "You still think Morton was the beginning? He was the end result of a chain of choices laid out years ago." Beneath the sentence was a strange symbol, a circle with 2 diagonal slashes, once used in documents related to an independent oversight unit that had been shut down 8 years earlier. Dan stared at the symbol for a long time, as if the past had returned, speaking in a language he thought he had forgotten. 3 days after Lisa disappeared, Malchus began to notice subtle irregularities around him that defied logic. A silver-gray sedan parked across the street from his house kept changing spots every day, yet never left the neighborhood. Early in the morning, when he pulled the curtain in the living room, he noticed the mailbox door was slightly ajar. The metal edge had been pried, not enough to raise suspicion from a passerby, but just enough to unsettle someone with experience in organized crime investigations. He reviewed the security cameras surrounding the house. The system was fully operational, but a clip recorded in the middle of the night revealed something strange. A hooded figure stood still by the back gate for nearly 2 minutes. No movement in, no movement out. The face was turned away, but the posture and unwavering presence conveyed a clear message. This was a warning. The next morning, Malchus opened the mailbox and found a white envelope with no return address, no name, no stamp. Inside was a plain A4 sheet printed in large laser-fought letters. "Silence is safety." The ink was thick and decisive, shattering any illusion of coincidence. It was a command that needed no confirmation. The paper was standard, untraceable. The thermal laser ink left no unique identifiers, and the fingerprints on the smooth surface had been completely wiped. He sat down and read the line again. His face showed no expression, but his hand flipped the sheet over as if hoping to find more data. It was blank. What stirred inside him was not fear or anger, but the cold familiarity of an old memory. Years ago, during a sensitive investigation, he had dismissed a similar letter, trusting that threats alone could never bend justice. 3 days later, the only witness was killed. The case collapsed due to the absence of living testimony. Malchus had spent years learning how to live with that name, that death. He wouldn't make the same mistake again. Without informing Dan, he reset the entire security system around the house, changed access codes to the data drives, and upgraded the encryption levels for every copy of the Lisa and Morton files. Every move was slow, deliberate, and precise. He then used a portable forensic kit to analyze the paper and ink on site. logged preliminary results, and sent all materials to the FBI lab under internal protocol. On the paperwork, it was marked as unverified sample related to interference in federal investigation, enough to keep it under wraps temporarily. That night, as he powered up his computer to continue reviewing footage from the area where Lisa had been taken, an email appeared just as he accessed the secure system. The sender's address was hidden. The subject line read, "Still think you're in control?" The body contained only a 12-second video, no voiceover, no caption. It showed Lisa being forced into a black truck by two masked men, moving with practiced efficiency. The timestamp did not align with any footage from the local apartment complex's surveillance system. That meant it had been recorded by a separate, covert device, possibly one set up to monitor Lisa, or perhaps to track Malkus's own reaction. He remained still after the video ended. The screen's glow reflected off his rigid cheekbones. His eyes didn't blink, and his hands stayed on the keyboard. Someone was orchestrating the situation with surgical emotional precision, pushing Malkus into heightened alert while concealing their identity. Everything felt staged, like a chessboard where the next move wouldn't be based on evidence, but on whether he had the will to continue or retreat. After nearly 20 years wearing the seal of the government, Malkus felt something for the first time, that the law he represented was now being observed by another system, one invisible, effective, and unconcerned with legality. But a system like that had a flaw. It believed silence was the end, and that was exactly what he intended to break. Dan woke earlier than usual, his mind heavy. The scattered pieces of Lisa's disappearance, Morton's buried records, the threat to Malkus, they all pointed towards something still undefined. Sitting at his office desk, he opened the annual personnel transfer lists. A strange pattern emerged when he reviewed the early units Morton had served in. 11 officers had been recruited in the same wave and assigned to different departments, yet all shared one common trait. They had been sponsored by Raymond Kessler, the former Deputy Director of Human Resources, who had retired 3 years ago. Kessler had once been known for preserving tradition in recruitment, consistently declaring that all he needed was loyalty, decisiveness, and immunity to public opinion. On paper, all officers from this cohort had positive evaluations, no formal violations. But when Dan dug deeper into the internal complaint archives, a disturbing coincidence emerged. Every single one had been named in reports alleging racism or excessive force against black individuals or immigrants. All complaints had been dismissed under identical reasons: lack of video evidence, uncooperative witnesses, or automatic deletion from the system after 3 months due to data sanitization protocols. Dan printed the full list and marked each name in red ink. Morton's name was not the most prominent, just one link in a chain, but clearly a link that had been preserved and shielded. He reached out to a retired officer who had once overseen personnel records and now lived in the suburbs. The man didn't speak much, but after holding Dan's gaze for a few silent minutes, he nodded. "You're touching a group that doesn't appear on paper. They call themselves the Value Guardians, always protecting one another. How do they identify themselves? Not by rank, by closed-loop trust. Anyone who pushes back either gets relocated or quietly neutralized. Morton, he's just a well-trained apprentice." On his way back, Dan carried an old file the retired officer had given him. It was from a confidential internal summit 6 years ago. Within it, a group of officers had signed a pledge to uphold traditional principles in maintaining order and elite recruitment. The wording seemed hollow at first, but when Dan reviewed the signatures, he noticed 4 of them now held training and academic roles at the new police academy. Others had moved into leadership positions in lightly scrutinized districts. He returned to the office and pulled the internal transfer records from the past 6 months. As he scanned for Oscar Reed, the officer who had publicly opposed Morton and was immediately reassigned, Dan froze. Oscar had worked in a division run by Lieutenant Bradford, one of the names from the 6-year-old summit file. No official explanation had been offered for Oscar's transfer. The reason stated, internal reassignment based on skill alignment. A reel of decisions Dan had once signed off on began replaying in his mind like a long, silent recording. He had once believed he held the power to shape a fairer force. But the deeper he looked into the buried records, the more it felt like he was navigating a maze carefully laid out beforehand. The signature on each decision might have been his, but the paths leading to them had long been drawn. He put down his pen and struck through a name on the list. The question that surfaced cut like a wound. How many decisions I signed were ever truly mine? In that moment, Dan understood he was no longer merely the head of a police department. He had just become an intruder inside a system that had learned to survive in the dark. The Personnel Oversight Council's meeting room was located on the 3rd floor of the Central Administrative Building, a quiet space with no signs or markers. Dan walked in on time, his uniform crisply pressed, his face expressionless. Around the long rectangular table, 5 people were already seated. In the center sat the deputy director, a silver-haired man with seasoned, cold eyes. On both sides were representatives from the Behavioral Control Unit and the state's Internal Affairs Division. The air in the room was thick, as if every word spoken had already been weighed in advance. The presiding officer began with a brief question, devoid of pleasantries. "Mr. Carter, we want to hear again why you chose to issue a suspension on the spot rather than proceed through protocol," Dan replied, his voice steady and level. "Because I have a responsibility to stop abuse of power before it causes consequences. I believe that without that decision, the risk would have escalated beyond control." A records officer seated on the right tapped his pen against a notepad. "Do you not think that action might be seen as disrupting the internal chain of command? A unilateral move?" Dan did not retract his stance. "I think remaining silent while an officer points a gun at a federal agent is the real disruption." The deputy director didn't intervene immediately, but his expression shifted. As the questioning subsided, he leaned forward, voice low but clear. "I understand your actions were done in honor of the force, but you must also understand the limits of individual action. There are things you cannot control, and you should keep your distance from someone who's become a focal point. If not, you risk pulling the entire system into a crisis no one can contain." Anne looked directly at him. "If the system is strong, it doesn't fear crisis. But if it collapses just because one person is exposed as wrong, then maybe it was weaker than we thought." An older member of the council, a former veteran inspector, spoke up with a moralistic yet hollow tone. "Justice doesn't always need to be demonstrated in a parking lot. Some matters are better handled internally. Your actions, however justified, drew unwanted public scrutiny to the department." Dan didn't respond. He simply looked around the room. Everyone was formally dressed, documents neatly arranged, their voices measured, but their eyes lacked concern for the truth. What they feared was entanglement. They didn't want clarity, they wanted damage control. The meeting concluded after more than an hour, ending with a promise to consider further review during next month's behavioral evaluation. Dan said nothing as he left the room, walking down the hallway like someone who knew he'd just entered an uneven game of chess. In the parking lot, he sat in his car, opened his phone to check emails, and saw a message from an unknown number. The screen displayed a single line, no punctuation. "The closer you stand to the light, the sharper the shadow behind you." Dan stared through the windshield, his hand tightening around the steering wheel. He wasn't afraid of the message, but he began to understand. The enemy he faced wasn't just a man named Morton. It was something larger, silent and layered. And perhaps the Morton incident wasn't the beginning, only a subtle sign of something long skewed. The rumor began like a tiny spark, quiet but flammable in all the right places. An anonymous post appeared on the internal police forum, its title terse and shocking. "Be cautious with agent claiming FBI. Has anyone verified?" Below was a photo of Malchus standing in the Hapakal supermarket parking lot, arms raised, cropped just before he displayed his badge. The caption suggested his actions were suspicious and hinted at impersonating federal authority. The post initially drew only a few dozen views, but within 2 hours, it had been reposted to a private group, one populated by officers who had trained with Morton during early sessions. From there, the spread accelerated. External social media groups began to repackage the content, adding anonymous account claiming to be a former investigator shared an internal log alleging that Malchus had once been suspended for 3 months over tampering with witness files in an old case. Those who knew the truth stayed silent. The skeptics spoke the loudest. Old photos resurfaced. One showed Malchus leaving a federal building during an investigation 3 years prior, maliciously captioned, "Upholder of Law," or someone rewriting it to fit his will. An excerpt from a disciplinary record, previously retracted and deleted from public databases, suddenly reappeared, cropped out of context, turning a man once exonerated into a perfect emblem of suspicion. Malchus's office, once quiet, became a place others passed without pause. Some colleagues no longer met his gaze. A few switched seats during meetings. Others pretended to be busy when he entered. No one said anything directly, but the air thickened by the hour. Meanwhile, online chatter around the self-proclaimed FBI surged, turning his name into a point of controversy on both professional and politicized platforms. He made no public rebuttal, issued no clarifications. Instead, he sat beside Maya in a small cafe 3 blocks from the precinct, a laptop between them. Maya traced the origin of the first post, matching IP addresses, login credentials, and access timestamps. The data pointed to a computer that had connected to the department's internal network exactly a week earlier, coinciding with Morton's suspension and the tech division's audit. That device was registered in the system, tied to an ID cluster under the Special Training Unit A Group, once exempted from internal checks under a policy issued more than 6 years ago under the guise of Advanced Strategic Response Team. A unit originally formed to preserve departmental culture, it had evolved into a haven for those who shared ideology, loyalty, and unwavering protection of the old power structure. As the final source code lines appeared on screen, Maya forwarded a screenshot of a chat message from that private group to Malchus. The faded text carried a clear message. To protect the system, sometimes we must sacrifice a few names. She followed up with another direct message. No icons, no punctuation. They're turning you into the scapegoat. Malchus stared at the words, his palms tightening under the table. He was used to direct attacks, to muzzle rifles, and battlefield pressure, but this time, the enemy didn't shoot. They erased through doubt, built altars of falsehood, and pushed him over using the silence of those who once stood beside him. Maya Reyes entered Malchus's office with a calm demeanor, but her eyes carried something that made him wary. She introduced herself briefly, without handing over a card or referencing any media agency. Her voice was steady, almost unreadable, concealing the defiant force of someone who had once confronted the most sensitive corners of law enforcement. Her name had become known after a series of investigative articles exposing cover-ups within the Riverside Police Department. Her press credentials were revoked after the final piece ran on the front page. "I'm not here for an interview," she said, placing a small leather pouch on the table. "I'm here because you seem to be the only one in this case not entangled in the system I've been tracking for years." Malchus straightened up, arms crossed. He was never quick to trust, especially when information came from a source without any formal verification process. But Maya didn't come empty-handed. She opened her pouch and pulled out a short list encrypted with internal ID protocol. Each line detailed a case, code, time, location, officer involved, and file status. What stood out was the recurring label next to each entry, restricted from public retrieval. They moved to a secure analysis room. Malchus uploaded a mirrored FBI archive, while Maya used an encryption tool from her anonymous source. As they cross-referenced line by line, a disturbing pattern emerged. The victims were all people of color. The intervening officers were basic to mid-level. Witness statements vanished within 24 hours. Camera footage always malfunctioned. No one had ever been formally disciplined. Malchus stared at the screen, then turned to Maya. Where did your source come from? Maya paused. I can't say, but I believe he worked in internal tech ops, and I believe you're holding the missing piece. They reviewed 3 recent cases, including one in the same district where Morton had briefly been promoted. The officer's name was listed in Maya's document, but absent from all FBI-accessible files. When Malchus dug deeper, a notice popped up. This document requires confirmation from the State Personnel Protection Agency. He knew he had reached a politically sensitive block. Under the dim lights, Maya's expression shifted slightly as she shut her laptop. Did you know, she said slowly, some files are deleted just because they make the system feel ashamed? Malchus didn't answer. After a long pause, he rested his hand on the file and said quietly, You're taking a risk. Maya tilted her head, half smiling. Because someone once told me the law isn't wrong, only the people who should uphold it ran away too soon. Before leaving, she opened her pouch again and handed him a small voice recorder. I can't verify the voices, but this conversation doesn't deserve to be hidden from justice. No more was said. The door closing behind Maya marked a turning point from which Malchus knew he could not return. He plugged the recorder into a secured port. The FBI system launched a deep voice analysis module. After authenticating, he filtered the noise, isolated vocal layers, and watched 2 audio waves appear. One was a deep male voice, rough and deliberate. The other was younger, faster, less controlled. The software ran its comparison. 30 seconds later, it confirmed an 87% match with Nathan Morton. The other voice matched Lieutenant Brad Holloway, Morton's former supervisor. Malchus wasn't surprised, but he played it from the beginning. Morton's voice came first, along with table tapping and heavy breathing. I'm sick of holding back when I go down to the south side. I feel like I need their permission just to wear this damn uniform. Brad's reply was crisp. Then don't hold back. If you need to send a message, do it. I'll cover the logistics. Morton hesitated. What if a camera catches something? The rookies get curious. Brad didn't flinch. It'll be handled. If it stays in the internal system, no one sees it. Do it like we rehearsed. Malchus sat up straight. He replayed the last part 3 times. Every word from Brad came without pause, as if it were standard protocol. He rewound again, taking notes. Send a message. I'll cover the logistics, like we rehearsed. This wasn't a casual exchange. It was directive, not a formal order, but part of an underground system where misconduct was anticipated, normalized, and shielded. Maya didn't take notes or record. She watched the screen, eyes unblinking. When the playback ended, she said, This isn't just verbal permission. It's collusion between someone in power and someone ready to cross the line. A system that allows wrongdoing to exist before it's even acted out. Malchus saved the file, encrypted it under a unique code, and submitted a verification request through the secure channel. Then he called Dan and requested a meeting within the hour. In a camera-free room, Dan sat across from Malchus and Maya, listening in silence. When the tape ended, the room felt heavier. Dan stared at the now dark screen, lips tight, then exhaled. He was once nominated for Deputy Training Director. Now I understand why this system never feels shame. No one spoke further. The tape had said it all. Brad wasn't alone, and Morton, the enforcer, was merely a byproduct of a distorted framework. Maya turned to Malchus. If you release this, she said calmly, you know what it means. Malchus nodded. Holding his badge between his fingers, he said, If I stay silent, I'm not worthy of wearing this. After cross-checking the list of cases Morton had handled during his first 3 years, Malchus began to notice a disturbing pattern. Most of the cases lacked surveillance footage, a large proportion of the detainees were people of color, and nearly all reports followed the same structure. The phrase resisting law enforcement appeared with excessive frequency, almost as if it had become a habitual entry rather than a factual account. One name made him pause longer. Terrence Wyatt, a third-year sociology student, was arrested during a routine traffic stop on the city's outskirts. The reported reason was failure to exit vehicle upon request, verbal opposition. Morton had filed the report and personally transported him. Terrence was held for 48 hours and released in a mentally stable condition. A month later, he took his own life in a rented apartment near campus. The cause of death was filed under unspecified psychological factors. Malchus contacted the university where Terence had studied. The meeting was arranged quickly through an old connection in the law faculty. He spent the morning speaking with several of Terence's friends, gathering scattered memories. A quiet but intelligent student, not fond of public arguments, who had plans for graduate school. One friend said after that incident he wasn't the same. He stopped leaving his room, skipped classes, and always looked like he was afraid something was following him. A professor recalled something more haunting. In Terence's final class, during a lecture on civil rights, he said without looking up, "Some people wear uniforms that make me feel like I don't exist. I don't know where I live anymore." Malchus wrote down every word. Sensing the deep and prolonged pain behind them, he reviewed Terence's original detention report, the handwritten draft prior to being transcribed into the official file. In the comments section, Morton had written, "This guy thinks he's too smart to listen to cops. Needs to be dealt with before that attitude spreads." The remark stopped Malchus cold. It wasn't a legal note. It was hostile, personal, and unacceptable for any public officer. Walking out from the campus grounds, Malchus paced along a row of parked cars, mind churning with past and present. Morton wasn't just violent. He had a pattern of targeting people of color who didn't show submission, those who exhibited independent thinking, intelligence, or simply refused to lower their heads. Outside the gate, a young woman leaned against a stone pillar, her gaze fixed on him. She wore a thin jacket, her hair tied up, her face sharp and pale. As he approached, she spoke first. "I'm Jade, Terence's sister." Her voice carried no bitterness, only clarity. "I know why you're here, and I know you won't find anything by looking at the files." She pulled out a thin, time-worn envelope. "My brother left something. No one's read it except me." Malchus accepted it, his eyes resting on the faded seal. His chest tightened, as though the past had just opened a door he had never dared approach. Jade Wyatt's apartment was on the third floor of an old building at the city's edge, where no one noticed her among the quiet hallways and rusted stairs. She lived alone, avoiding the media ever since Terence's name flooded student forums and social networks. Back then, all questions revolved around his sudden death and debates on campus mental health, but no one delved into the silence that followed from someone who once dreamed of graduate school. Jade had never given interviews, nor had she appeared at any hearings. "You're the first person I've ever reached out to," she said as she invited Malchus to sit by a small wooden desk. On it lay a yellowed envelope, still sealed. She didn't hand it over immediately, but sat across from him in silence, her eyes steady, as someone who had watched a loved one be crushed by a system where explanations always came too late. Jade quietly opened the envelope and unfolded a letter worn at the edges. She placed it in front of Malchus without saying a word. The first line, in slanted print, read, "If you're reading this, it means I've failed to stay silent any longer." Terence described the night Morton arrested him. He likened the holding cell to a dark box, where language itself felt like handcuffs. Morton's words struck him over and over like a ritual. "Guys like you think the more you study, the more you understand justice." No one stopped Morton. Passers-by looked down at the floor. He wrote that the humiliation didn't stem from physical pain, but from the silence of those in uniform who chose to say nothing. At the end of the letter, Terence wrote, "He's not afraid of cameras." Once, he smiled and pointed at one and said, "I know who's watching, and I know they'll delete this if they need to." The next line made Malchus freeze. "I'm not the first he did this to. Someone else was arrested months before me." He called him the witness who didn't get to speak. Malchus folded the letter, holding it for a long while as though it were the final words of someone who never got the chance to speak. The details weren't just emotional, they were warnings. The term witness who didn't get to speak hinted at a pattern, someone silenced before they could testify. If true, this wasn't an isolated case. Morton may have cleared his tracks in advance, and someone may have helped him do it, invisibly. Malchus asked to scan the letter with a specialist device, preserving even the smudged ink at the bottom corner. He promised Jade not to release any details without proper verification, but he would use it to pursue the one Terence had named. Before he stood to leave, Jade placed her hand on the folded letter. Her voice was low, yet firm. "If you people won't touch this, it'll stay buried like so many others. But if you've opened it, "Don't close it again." Malchus nodded and walked out without looking back. In his hand was only a copy, but in his mind, a new name had been carved into the list, and no one dared speak aloud. 3 days after the scheduled testimony, Lisa Turner's file was officially changed from absent without explanation to suspected illegal detention. Dan signed the confirmation order with a firm stroke and handed the file over to the Internal Affairs desk. The decision came during an emergency meeting with the Special Response Unit, after all contact with Lisa was lost without a trace of her departure. A task force was sent to her motel in the Jefferson district. Neighbors reported not seeing her leave that day, hearing no loud noises, no arguments, no calls for help. Lisa's room remained intact, the door locked from the outside. All personal belongings were still inside, but a small, clean scratch on the doorknob caught attention, a sign that Malchus, a former tech specialist, immediately recognized. The door had been breached using specialized tools. The motel's security footage was retrieved, this time without any system errors. The data showed Lisa leaving her room in casual attire, a crossbody bag slung over her shoulder, heading downstairs early in the morning. But at the moment she locked the door, a shadowy figure briefly appeared behind her. The angle was unclear, showing only someone standing close to the door just as Lisa's phone shut off. It was also when her smartwatch lost connection. Malchus quickly coordinated with the FBI's data unit. They extracted GPS routes from both of Lisa's devices for the past 3 days. Both signals cut off at the same spot, an abandoned industrial zone on the city's western edge, closed down the year before due to soil contamination. From that moment, no signals were detected. The location data stopped abruptly, with no signs of further movement. A system-level check on Lisa's phone revealed that her browser history, call logs, text messages, and even internal messaging apps had all been wiped. The deletion wasn't initiated from her device, but through a remote access interface with admin-level clearance. The process was sophisticated, precise, and executed within 6 minutes of her disappearance. Malchus held the printed access logs, eyes fixed on the last line. Operation complete. Security status restored. System tags clearly showed the source of the command, a device previously traced to the video tampering case at Hapakal Supermarket. Maya confirmed the IP address matched a strange log entry they had saved before. All traces led back to the same entity or network. A city map lay open before them. Malchus pointed at the abandoned industrial site, while Maya monitored a suspicious VPN identifier. Neither of them spoke until he muttered, voice heavy, "They know Lisa was the last piece holding the truth, and now they're trying to erase that too." Maya looked up, a chill running down her spine. She understood this was no longer just an internal investigation. This was entry into a network that tracked each step the investigators took and wasn't afraid to strike before anyone could speak. On the monitor in Malchus's temporary office, a new email appeared in the inbox. No subject line, no sender address, just an attachment titled Untitled PMP4. The file was small, just over 9 megabytes, but its precision made Malchus pause. He didn't open it right away. He first transferred the file to an isolated offline system and checked the encryption structure. It had a familiar format, multi-layered compression, a technique used by sophisticated internal groups. He launched the file and adjusted the volume to a low but audible level. The screen revealed a dim room lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb. Lisa sat on the concrete floor, hands bound behind her back, a black cloth wrapped over her eyes. Her breathing confirmed her identity. No one else appeared in frame. A distorted voice echoed, heavily processed and hollow, like from a deep underground chamber. "If you want her to live, stop now. Delete all the data you're holding and walk away from Morton." The message ended bluntly. Then the footage showed Lisa struggling, repeating Malchus's name 3 times in fear before the video cut to black. From the opposite desk, Maya looked over and saw Malchus's expression tighten. He stayed silent for several minutes. She walked over and asked to see the footage. After watching it, she fell quiet, then bit her lip. "We need to release this. Get it to the media, let as many people see it as possible. If the public reacts, they'll have no way to retreat. But Malchus shook his head, still staring at the screen. If they sent the video, it means they're not ready to kill her. But if we corner them, Lisa will be the first to pay the price. Maya clenched her fists, then nodded. They agreed. Stay silent. Act discreetly. Within the hour, Maya traced the original data packet, peeling back layers of routing codes. The path led to a disguised VPN server running on an internal platform known only to those with high-level admin clearance. After reversing the encryption, they discovered a strange link to an old roster officers exempt from background checks after 5 years of service. Among them, 4 had ties to Morton during a training program, and 3 were still active in data and system administration. Dan received a briefing from Malchus and Maya. His face grew grave when he read the final lines. All 3 accounts accessed the system on the night Lisa vanished, and all were part of a group labeled Structural Safeguard, a classification no longer publicized after internal audit protocols were revised. Dan clenched the file and quietly opened the video. As he scrubbed to the final second, an unusual image appeared before the frame went black. A police badge slashed with a bold red line, the stroke sharp like a cut across honor. Malchus froze, narrowing his eyes as recognition struck. He opened a federal archive he had once reviewed. That symbol was once the mark of an extremist ideological group within the force, disbanded 5 years ago after a leak exposed systematic discrimination. He looked at Dan and spoke in a near whisper. They didn't send that video to protect Morton. They sent it to warn us. Dan nodded, his face weighed down with understanding. Both men knew this investigation had moved beyond personal matters. They were now standing on the thin edge between duty and the threats that targeted anyone who dared reshape the structure of power. Dan stared at the screen in front of him, the desk lamp's reflection shimmering on the thick folder beside his right hand. Morton's name appeared repeatedly across a string of internal reviews that had either been closed early, canceled, or marked as processing suspended. Everything looked too clean, almost artificial. Lisa's disappearance wasn't an accident. Oscar's transfer wasn't a routine administrative decision, and the barrage of fake news targeting Malchus had arrived at precisely the wrong moment. Dan realized Morton wasn't just being protected from the outside, but from within the very system he now led. He didn't log the case into the official system. Instead, Dan quietly devised a separate plan, built on 3 reliable leads he had once tested with both trust and risk. The first was Andrew Vellon, a technician formerly involved in federal-level internal investigations, now working at a civilian data security center. The second was Grace Miller, a former internal affairs officer who resigned after refusing to close a case of abuse 3 years ago. The third was Malchus. All 3 communicated through encrypted channels, strictly avoiding emails or documents from department servers. Valen was tasked with retracing Morton's internal network activity over the past 6 months. Grace reviewed building access logs, flagging timestamps where Morton was present without official justification. Dan acted as coordinator, ensuring nothing left a trace. After 3 days, results started to surface. Morton had accessed the basement tech area on a morning 2 days after his suspension, though that incident wasn't recorded in any shift logs. The account he used belonged to an employee who had resigned a month earlier. In addition, 2 IP addresses Morton had used to log into a private forum were directly linked to a computer in the maintenance room, an area typically left unmonitored. Dan recorded the findings in his personal notebook and locked it inside a drawer secured by fingerprint access. But signs of trouble began to appear. 3 department heads abruptly asked him to submit a weekly activity monitoring report, something that had never been part of any standard protocol. Dan ignored the first request, but when it came a second time, he began to sense someone was tracking his steps. By the next morning, one of the 3 had filed filed a formal complaint with the Personnel Board, citing unexplained system access restrictions. Dan knew the situation had reached a sensitive threshold. He revoked access rights for 4 mid-level managers and temporarily disabled deep record retrieval functions. The move stirred quiet unrest internally, but Dan had no alternative. When someone's digging a well, you don't let others stand behind them with a shovel. That evening, returning to his car late, Dan opened the door, sat down, and froze. Something felt off. He leaned forward to check under the seat and found a basic listening device, the kind used for signal tracking, not audio recording. It was still active, the battery blinking faintly red. Dan removed it, slipped it into his pocket, turned on his phone, and called Malchus. As soon as the line connected, he spoke without greeting. "The game's on, but this time, someone on our side doesn't want it to end." The car darkened around him, the only sound his steady breathing, while an irreversible decision quietly took shape. Maya sat by the second-floor apartment window, eyes fixed on a black pickup parked 2 buildings away. It had appeared like clockwork for the past 3 days, always in the same spot, always at the same angle, despite the neighborhood having no shortage of parking. The license plate was masked by a dummy frame, but Maya had enough experience to spot surveillance when it became this unreasonably patient. She didn't react immediately. She took photos, noted timestamps, and sent them to Malchus with the caption, "If they think I don't see it, they're underestimating a woman who once tracked a cartel." That night, Maya changed clothes, tied her hair back, and left home in her own car as usual. She looped through the city center, stopped at a large cafe, then turned into a back alley, left her vehicle there, and walked back toward the apartment complex through a side route. She passed behind the night market fence, slipped through 2 narrow alleys, and approached the pickup. The lot was quiet, yellow light from the opposite building casting just enough glow to illuminate the undercarriage. Wearing thin gloves, she attached a GPS tracker under the rear frame using a magnet, then fixed a button-sized micro camera to the rearview mirror with a layer of clear adhesive. Less than 2 minutes later, she slipped away, vanishing into the night. Data began streaming in just past midnight. The route revealed the truck had left the neighborhood and headed toward the outskirts, stopping at a house nestled in sparse woodland nearly an hour from downtown. The owner's name didn't exist in any civil registry. The property was listed under a maintenance company that had long since shut down. Maya sat in front of her screen, fast-forwarding through the footage. The clip showed a tall man in a dark green windbreaker stepping out of the vehicle. His lower face was obscured, but his sharp gaze and fluid movement signaled formal training. Malchus sat beside her, eyes locked on the footage. He paused at a single frame, captured it, and ran it through a facial recognition tool. No results. The man wasn't in any current officer database. Maya reopened the list of individuals who had once trained alongside Morton, filtering for those exempt from recent internal inspections. 7 names matched. 3 of them had minor policy infractions erased after what was labeled a collective behavior review. Maya forwarded all the data to Dan, adding a note, "If we plant one more eye in that house, the whole network will unravel." Dan replied succinctly, approved the idea, but insisted on using non-departmental channels. Maya began contacting an independent tech team and prepared long-range audio surveillance gear. Before the day ended, Maya received a message from an unknown number. The font was outdated. The message had no name or country code. The content read, "You're the messenger, but sometimes the truth must be buried, unless the messenger wants to be buried too." She didn't reply. She forwarded the message to Malchus. After reading it, he exhaled slowly and looked up at her. "They're starting to feel the ground slipping," he said, his voice tight like a tensioned wire. "And that's when we need to grip the board tighter." In their eyes, the game had long moved past justice. It was now about who would still be standing once the truth finally pushed everything beyond the safe zone. Maya sat in the dark room, eyes fixed on the screen as lines of code ran like electric currents. The data package containing the threatening video targeting Lisa wasn't a typical image file, but was encoded with a secondary encryption layer using a rare internal algorithm. typically employed in signal relay operations within surveillance zones. She traced the identifier string and linked it to a metadata collection system routed through VPN gateways leaking from an industrial sector in the western part of the city. An unusual IP address led her to a consumer-grade router once connected to a covert transmission grid in an abandoned warehouse complex. Maya cross-checked it with the city's security map and confirmed the coordinates matched a cluster of warehouses that had failed at auction due to a lack of registered ownership. She sent a summary report to Dan and Malchus. The next morning, they set off in an unmarked vehicle with temporary plates. Dan drove, eyes locked on the speedometer, while Malchus activated a signal jammer, ensuring no outgoing transmission within a 300-meter radius. The road leading to the warehouse cluster was blanketed in red dust, flanked by rusting containers and broken utility poles. The warning stripes barely visible, they stopped in front of warehouse number 14, a corrugated iron structure with pale, washed-out walls and no surveillance cameras, neither public nor private. Malchus stepped out first, scanning the surroundings. Under a thin layer of dust, fresh tire marks curved into the lot, indicating a vehicle had arrived within the last 12 hours. Temporary wiring stretched from a nearby power station across the fence and slipped through a gap between two panels. A recently emptied coffee can sat warm against the wall when Malchus picked it up. Beside it lay a torn cigarette pack, filters scattered across dry grass. They moved along the side of the warehouse, where a crack separated two iron sheets. Malchus pulled out a sensor-based listening device and pressed it to the surface. The first signal was the faint crackle of fluorescent lights, followed by heavy footsteps, then a subtle sound, a muffled sob, as if someone was choking back tears. Dan stayed silent, eyes locked on the wall. Maya confirmed through the earpiece that the audio matched perfectly with the video previously received. From afar, an old truck screeched and stopped in the opposite yard. Malchus signaled to hold back. Both men waited for Maya's update. Within 3 minutes, she transmitted an urgent message. She had rerouted the internal network around the warehouse, creating a gray zone, a buffer of electromagnetic silence that blocked all forms of digital communication, preventing those inside from calling for help or sending out data. Dan tightened his earpiece and glanced at Malchus. "We're going in. This time, no mistakes." He said nothing more, but the look in his eyes made clear every exit had already been sealed. What lay ahead wasn't just an abandoned structure, but a direct encounter with the machinery lurking beneath the system's orderly surface. And this time, failure would cost more than just a life. And the dim glow of dusk draped the warehouse complex like a grim curtain, concealing all movement within. All three sat in the car parked at the perimeter, silent for a few moments before Dan reviewed the plan. "I'll go through the main entrance and talk. When you see the left metal door open, that's your cue." Malchus nodded, dressed in a light black jacket, his locator and earpiece double-checked. Maya sat in the back, her ear pressed to the recorder, eyes glued to the screen showing electromagnetic activity. She carried no weapon, but held something sharper, a real-time alert system. Dan stepped out first, carrying an empty briefcase as a prop. He approached the front gate with a measured pace. A man posted outside stretched and looked his way, alert but not signaling any alarm. Dan stopped a few steps away, his voice calm with intentional pauses. "I'm the replacement, delivery, just tonight, then I'm gone." The guard stared for a beat, then whispered to someone inside. A minute later, Dan was waved in. The rusty door creaked open with a thin, eerie squeal, as if warning of something about to break. Behind the warehouse, Malchus crawled past rotting crates, eyes scanning the ground for hidden cameras or motion sensors. There were no high-tech defenses, just a sagging wire, a crooked panel, and a wooden latch barring a door. He silently clipped the lock and slipped inside, into a dark space reeking of old smoke and machine oil. Every step was calculated. In his earpiece, Dan's measured conversation played as background. At the center of the building, Lisa was held in a makeshift cell constructed from plasterboard. Her hands were tied, her head hung low, but she was still breathing. No guards, no locks. Malchus crouched beside her, quickly slicing the ropes and removing the tape. Her eyes fluttered open, wild and disoriented. before settling on him. That look alone made him grip her arm tighter as he pulled her up. Outside, Dan sensed a shift in the air. One of the men at the table asked, "Where's the briefcase? Why not check the goods before arriving?" Dan replied with measured vagueness, "I don't inspect the product, I just deliver." Before he finished speaking, another man stepped forward, fingers sliding into Dan's jacket. "No weapon? So what are you really here for?" Suspicion, long suppressed, began to swell. Malchus saw that Lisa was fully conscious and gently activated a vibration alert from his pocket. Outside, Dan felt it and didn't hesitate. He pivoted and drove a punch into the nearest guard's chest, then kicked over the metal table to block the exit. Chaos erupted instantly. Malchus pulled Lisa through the back exit as the front exploded into shouting. A gunshot rang out from somewhere, but no one was hit. The south gate burst open as Dan emerged, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead where he'd hit the table, but his eyes remained cold and sharp. They climbed into the vehicle. Maya sat in the back, holding Lisa and sending a wipe command to erase all trace routes. As the car rolled past the warehouse perimeter, Malchus looked out the window. His eyes landed on a black symbol spray-painted on the wall, an inverted triangle enclosing two overlapping letters, OB. He pointed it out. Dan followed his gaze, his face suddenly somber. "They're not just traffickers. They're the old part that never got purged from the force. And now, that old part knew someone had started digging into its roots." Lisa was brought into the emergency support center in near-total silence. Her face was pale, her hair matted at the temples, and the oversized coat made her look even more withdrawn. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if every movement around her was a potential threat. Maya sat beside the bed, holding Lisa's hand so gently it barely counted as contact. Dan stood at the doorway, exchanging quick words with a nurse about security protocol, his eyes constantly scanning the hallway. Malchus stayed outside behind the glass, not wanting his presence to add any more pressure than Lisa had already endured. The same girl who had once dared to raise her phone in the parking lot was now unable to speak when someone entered the room. Each door opening made her flinch and turn her head in alarm. When the doctor asked questions, she only nodded or shook her head. Maya spoke in hushed tones, explaining what had happened after Lisa disappeared, telling her that Malchus hadn't given up, that Dan had confronted his own department to find her, but Lisa offered no response. She turned her face to the wall, shoulders drawn in tight. For a long while, as the room dimmed and the lights were lowered, Lisa began to whisper broken phrases. She spoke of the sealed room where she'd been kept, no windows, no sounds except for the whir of a fan and the scent of chemicals. Her captor never showed his face. His voice was even, devoid of rage, but colder than any death threat. "If you speak, next time won't be as simple as being locked up." That sentence had haunted her since the moment the bag was pulled over her head until she was dumped on the roadside that morning. At that point, her voice broke, and her hand clenched the bedsheet tightly. Malchus watched from afar before asking to check for physical signs of trauma. As he gently lifted her wrist, he saw a deep purple mark still etched into her skin. The binding wasn't haphazard or rushed. It had been meant to restrain over time. Thin nylon rope had left clear impressions. To him, that confirmed this wasn't an impulsive act, but a planned operation. Lisa recoiled when she saw him staring too long at her wrist. Her eyes suddenly sharpened with caution. She whispered into the air that what she knew went beyond what Morton wanted hidden. "I saw the logo on the ID card. It wasn't familiar, not from any standard patrol unit." She didn't say anything more. Maya tried to draw her back in. "We made it in time. No one's going to erase you again, I promise." But Lisa only shook her head lightly, tears beginning to stain the pillow. Dan called for an emergency meeting that same afternoon. Yet before it began, Lisa requested not to testify, not to have her name included in any documents related to the case. She asked for full anonymity and to be removed entirely from the investigation. Maya fell silent. Dan exhaled deeply. Malchus said nothing. That night, the hospital hallway was nearly empty. Under the dim yellow light from above, Lisa sat hunched on a long bench. hands clasped together, eyes fixed unblinking on the tile floor. Malchus stood at the end of the corridor, keeping his distance. He knew that calling for justice wasn't enough. For Lisa to speak again, something more than a promise of protection was needed. It required a trust that the system had long since eroded in her. Malchus returned to the hospital late in the day, just as the sunlight faded and the corridors emptied. He entered Lisa's room alone, with no assistant, no equipment, and not wearing his uniform. The room was as quiet as before, but this time Lisa didn't fully avert her gaze. She saw him and slowly sat up, as if waiting for something she couldn't name. He didn't bring up the investigation or the upcoming meeting. Sitting in the chair near the window, hands resting on his knees, he looked at her like someone who had known her before everything fell apart. He talked about that day, the shouting, the gun just inches from his face. He described the feeling of raising his hand, not knowing if he'd be allowed to lower them again. What steadied him, he said, was the look from behind, a witness's gaze that hadn't turned away. Lisa sat silently for a long time, hands intertwined atop the blanket. She lowered her head before asking the only question on her mind. "Are you angry with me?" Her voice slipped out as if it had been trapped beneath years of guilt. Malchus responded with a calm, steady look, free of judgment. "I never thought you owed me anything, but I know that in that moment, you were the one person who didn't look away. I needed that, and now I need it again." The room thickened with silence. No wind, no traffic outside. Lisa looked up. Her eyes still carried traces of fear, but now there was something else. Reason, attentiveness. She bit her lip and gently gripped her left wrist where the nylon marks still lingered. Then she spoke. The man who took her wasn't a stranger. He wore what looked like a medical technician's uniform, but once inside the vehicle, he used a police-grade radio. His voice was sharp and precise, using the code C49. Lisa had previously worked in a supermarket's temporary security office, so she knew the code. It was reserved for riot control units, never used for civilians. That was enough to tell her what she had been caught in wasn't a mere warning. Malchus nodded, his expression calm but his thoughts racing. That kind of radio access wasn't publicly available. Whoever used it had clearance within the state police network, which meant Lisa's abduction wasn't just Morton acting alone. It had been planned, coordinated, and executed by a group with internal authority. Lisa looked at him as if measuring his reaction, knowing he came from a world where the impossible was often true. "I'll testify," she said, voice slow but steady. "But I have one condition. If I disappear again, you must be the one who keeps everything, truth, data, originals, whatever's left." Malchus stood, not answering immediately. He pulled a sheet of paper from his shirt pocket. Not a warrant, not a report. A handwritten agreement signed by Dan and Maya. It was a high-level witness protection guarantee submitted directly to the Internal Investigative Council. He placed it on the bedside table and finally spoke. "I won't be the only one who knows the truth. We'll do this together." The next day, Dan signed an order to reconvene the council. Maya was assigned to oversee witness protection. A mid-ranking officer with no affiliation to biased units was appointed to escort Lisa. The official hearing resumed, but this time, the truth no longer lived in shadows. 3 days after agreeing to testify, Lisa was moved to a safe house listed under the Investigation Council's Special Protection Directive. An independent officer was assigned for round-the-clock surveillance, and Maya took night shifts to ensure no mistakes were made. The house was quiet to the point of stillness, and even footsteps were softened by instruction to avoid triggering Lisa's anxiety. But by the third night, the tension began to crack. While reviewing the surveillance feeds, Maya noticed the security system had gone offline for 3 full minutes. No alerts, no access logs. She rushed upstairs and found Lisa's bedroom door slightly ajar. The room was dark, the nightlight had fallen to the floor, the blanket was tossed aside, and a chair had been knocked over. She called Lisa's name, but there was no response. When she turned on her phone's flashlight, she saw Lisa curled up under the bed, arms over her head, body trembling uncontrollably. They didn't wait another minute. Maya quickly grabbed a few personal items, guided Lisa out of the house and into her own car, locked it down, and drove off along a route not recorded in any official file. She disabled all tracking devices, switched off her phone, and replaced the SIM card as soon as they left the residential zone. No messages were sent. As the car turned onto a tree-lined road leading toward the western hills, Lisa remained silent, her wide eyes dry and alert, as if used to being hunted. Maya brought her to a wooden cabin her father used every winter, a location not listed in any police database. The power supply was self-contained, with no internet, no smart devices. Once inside, Maya checked every window and exit route. She even taped over the lenses of all electronics, ensuring no unseen eyes were watching. Lisa huddled on a small chair by the fireplace, staring into the flames without blinking. That night, neither of them slept. Lisa later explained that while hiding under the bed, she heard soft footsteps and a man's voice whispering her name just inches from her ear. She hadn't seen his face, but the voice repeated her name, as if he knew she was awake. Maya checked the system's logs and confirmed the alarm blackout matched the moment Lisa woke up. Someone had known her precise location and the perfect time to strike. At dawn, Lisa sprang up at the sound of the front door creaking open. Her reflexes kicked in before she could control them, convinced the man had returned. Maya had to grip her shoulders tightly to calm her. After making tea, she sat across from Lisa without question, handing her a small piece of paper, a list of all personnel previously assigned to protect Lisa. One name was circled in red. This one had a prior complaint for leaking internal intel. The case was buried. Do you think it's related? Lisa stared at the paper for a long time, then nodded slowly. I don't want to suspect everyone, but it feels like someone's dismantling each lock from the inside. Maya's phone rang. It was Malchus. His voice was heavier than usual, each word sounding like it dragged behind suppressed rage. We're not just being watched. Someone's trying to erase every piece of evidence, starting with the people. Lisa heard every word. After the call ended, she spoke for the first time without a tremble in her voice. They need to see it with their own eyes before I disappear. Maya looked at her, and for the first time no longer saw someone needing protection, but a threat their enemies feared most. The next morning, with dew still fogging the cabin windows, Lisa sat at a small wooden desk near the window, eyes fixed on the distant forest. Maya was making coffee when Lisa finally spoke, not facing her, but as if narrating to herself. I still have a clip on my old phone. I never sent it. Maya froze mid-step, then approached without pressing her. The old phone was buried deep in the same bag Lisa had carried since day one. The battery was nearly dead. Just booting it up triggered a low-power alert. Lisa plugged it in and waited, then opened a video folder. Among a list of supermarket camera recordings, an oddly named file appeared. Rec 1 TMP. It lasted less than a minute. The footage was unstable, sometimes swaying from shaky hands, other times jolting as Lisa crouched behind a car. But mid-sigure it captured Morton aiming his gun at Malchus. His harsh commands, sunlight catching the pistol's white grip as he pulled back the trigger. Maya watched intently, but what made her pause wasn't that. In the final seconds before Lisa shut off the phone, the camera swung across the hood of a patrol car. A man in a gray shirt and slacks, no visible ID, leaned casually against the door of vehicle number 4. His face appeared for barely 2 seconds. Lisa froze the frame, zoomed in. She didn't recognize the man, but when Maya leaned closer, she stiffened. That's him, Maya whispered, eyes locked on the screen. Henry Callan, State Internal Affairs Chief, the one who personally signed Morton's reinstatement, even after 3 misconduct complaints. Maya opened her laptop and accessed the camera geolocation logs. She cross-checked the day's footage with vehicle placements. The car that man stood beside had plate number 3, F1290. but the GPS data listed it as under maintenance at the operations center that day. Maya sank into the chair, covering her mouth briefly. There's no reason for him to be there, and definitely not next to a car supposedly in the garage. Lisa looked again at the image and nodded, this time as if something inside her had finally snapped into place. He was there before Dan arrived, before Morton realized Malchus was federal. Malchus called in. When Maya described what she saw, he was silent for half a minute before confirming what all three had suspected but never dared say aloud. Callan wasn't just covering. He was there. He saw it happen and chose silence. This isn't negligence. This is complicity. They backed up the clip to 3 separate devices. One was stored on a physical hard drive locked in the office of a lawyer Maya trusted. Another was encrypted and sent to Dan with a brief note. Now he'll understand why the system never corrects itself. The third was sent via a secure federal line, marked under a custom code name to avoid internal interception. Lisa stared at the final frame once more. In it, Callan didn't speak or move. He simply stood there, watching. But that silence had thrown everything into chaos. Maya shut the screen and then turned to Lisa. You're the only one who saw it firsthand. But now, this video will let the entire state see it too. Lisa nodded. She closed her eyes, not out of fear this time, but to regain balance. She was no longer the girl hiding under the bed. Now she held a piece of evidence that spoke for itself, and it had just unlocked a door their enemies could no longer close. The records vault lay deep beneath the state police headquarters, dim yellow lights casting faint shadows along a damp corridor. Every footstep Malchus took echoed through the hollow space, reverberating like a collision with the layers of thought racing through his mind. After confirming Callan's face and the clip Lisa had left behind, he knew the entire scene had to be retraced from the beginning, starting with the place few dared to touch, personnel files. The creaking of an old metal door broke the silence as he pushed it open. The archive room was filled with non-digitized records. Hundreds of cardboard boxes stacked and coated with dust, the scent of aging paper faintly drifting in the air. A wall map helped Malchus quickly find the section covering personnel transfers from the time Morton first joined the force until now. He combed through each file, skimming transfer orders, disciplinary memos, and performance evaluation. Most were suspiciously smooth, as though any negative trace had been scrubbed clean long ago. A lone box in the far corner caught his eye. A yellowed slip of paper was taped on top, bearing the name James Holbrook, former Deputy of Human Resources, retired. No file code, no tracking seal. Opening it sent up a cloud of dry, dense dust. Beneath the scattered folders lay a brown leather notebook, its spine slightly cracked, but the pages intact and unmarred. The front cover bore only 3 handwritten letters: Private J.H. Malchus flipped through the opening pages. The handwriting was sharp and tidy, detailing workdays, staff reflections, and internal meeting notes. But the further he read, the clearer it became that this was no administrative journal. It was a personal log, written by someone who felt compelled to document the irregularities he couldn't speak aloud. Among the entries, one name appeared more than any other. A line from March 5 years ago stood out in bold. Morton, ineligible for reinstatement after February's disciplinary case. Verbal directive from higher-ups to restore his record. Filed a protest memo. No response. Every note came with a timestamp and a personal remark. Holbrook had once written that what he observed was not leniency, but deliberate orchestration. 2 years later, a hastily written line appeared in slanted script. Transfer Order 314. Morton reassigned to Ridgefall Patrol Unit. Receiving file listed a different name, did not match. Pressured to sign the approval, felt watched after that meeting. Malchus paused, flipped back and forth to compare dates. They aligned with the time Morton was implicated in an illegal detainment complaint, a case that never saw a formal investigation. The flicker of a fluorescent tube above him interrupted his focus. Malchus looked up, the familiar instinct of an investigator surfacing intelligently. His intuition warning he had just brushed against the outer layer of a long engineered wall. James Holbrook might have seen it all, and rather than go public, he chose to leave discreet traces behind, a signal for someone patient enough to pick up the trail. He took out his phone, captured a few key pages, and called Maya and Dan. His voice was rough but steady. "I found Holbrook's journal. He didn't stay silent entirely. Looks like he tried to fight this and they shut him down, but he knew it would come back and he left a door open for the next person." There was a pause. Maya said nothing. Dan took an audible breath, then replied, "Send me the full scans. We need to protect that thing like a living witness." Malchus said no more. He knew that from this moment on, that notebook was no longer a retired officer's reflection. It was the prologue to dismantling the entire power structure they were about to unravel. Turning through the notebook, Malchus noticed the entries followed a pattern too precise to be accidental. Holbrook hadn't just been a meticulous note-taker. He was building a map. Each entry, each line formed a puzzle piece. When arranged chronologically, a programmed chain of transfers emerged. Morton was repeatedly placed in locations where prior internal complaints had been filed but left unresolved. Each station had once been flagged for monitoring, yet no oversight had ever occurred. Soon, Malchus began seeing familiar names beside the notes about Morton. Individuals who had filed reports were all reassigned not long after speaking up. Some were marked temporary regional transfer, others moved to administrative roles. The pattern was consistent. The whistleblower vanished, the report disappeared, and Morton stayed. One entry read, "Internal complaint closed same day. The author was reassigned a week later. Possible top-down direct." He stopped at a page naming the Internal Affairs Unit that had handled Morton's files multiple times. Though the timeline spanned years, most cases had been funneled to a single oversight group. Within the list of personnel, one name stood out: Henry Callan. No further confirmation was needed. The man who had stood beside the patrol car when Morton drew his gun was now unmistakably revealed as the gatekeeper of the system's escape route. At the back of the notebook, the handwriting changed. The entries became sparse and uneven. A lone page contained just 4 lines. "Met Callan. Warned me to stop. Said more would be seen as internal sabotage. Last note. Don't let this system forget I once warned them." After that came silence in ink. The following pages bore no text, only a repeated symbol, a triangle with a horizontal slash, one per page. No dates, no notes. Holbrook had stopped writing, but he left a visible trail. He had been silenced, but this was his quiet protest. Maya received the scans from Malchus. She meticulously reviewed each page before launching encryption software, converting the data into a secure format, separating each image, assigning serial numbers, and saving them across 3 different drives. Dan arrived a few minutes later holding printed pages referencing the Internal Oversight Unit. He remained silent at first, scrutinizing every line. Finally, he placed the printouts on the table and spoke with a heavy tone. "We're not looking at isolated misconduct," Dan said, his eyes locked on the triangle symbol. "We're looking at a system. Morton was just a tool. The real machine is the people behind it, and now one of their faces is finally emerging." No one in the room disagreed. Holbrook's notebook had done more than accuse. It had exposed the blueprint of a network everyone had mistaken for routine. The office door swung open after 3 firm knocks. Dan entered without a word, his face stern and his posture cutting through the air like a force in itself. Henry Callan looked up from behind his desk, momentarily surprised but quickly composed. He set his pen down and smiled. "I figured you'd come," he said, then stood and extended a hand as if welcoming an old colleague to a casual meeting. The office was spacious and soundproofed, with high ceilings and windows facing the administrative square. On the wall hung medals and faded photos from Callan's years as a field officer. Dan walked in slowly and placed a thick folder on the desk in front of Callan before sitting down. The man across from him didn't need to ask what it was. He simply lifted the teapot and poured 2 cups of jasmine tea, pushing one across the desk. "You still drink jasmine, right? Like back in the West Division?" Callan leaned back in his chair. Dan said nothing. His eyes remained on the folder, where the names Morton and Holbrook stood out among transfer forms and notations marked with red tags. Callan set his cup down and slowed his voice. "You're trying to fix an entire system over a video in a parking lot?" Dan remained silent. Callan gave a soft chuckle, glancing at the edge of the file. "You know better than anyone. This world runs on compromise." Dan finally looked up. Compromise is one thing. Erasing records and sidelining whistleblowers is another. His back straightened. His voice wasn't loud, but it was resolute. How many reports were closed before reaching an independent reviewer? And how many people were forced into silence just to keep the system looking clean from the outside? Callan leaned back, fingers interlaced. "Everyone needs to know when to stop, Dan." His voice was calm, stripped of the guiding tone once used by a mentor. "I taught you that, didn't I? Stability matters more than heroics." The room went quiet for a beat. Dan looked out the window, then back at the man before him. Memories struck fast, like a blow. He remembered witnessing a colleague's transfer after filing a complaint about a tampered investigation. That day, Callan had given the order. Dan once believed the man was protecting the team. Now he saw clearly that Callan was defending a structure of power where anyone who spoke up became marked. "I used to think you were the last one in this system who still had a line you wouldn't cross," Dan said, voice low. "Now I see you drew that line to keep others from ever crossing it." Callan paused before rising and walking to a cabinet. He pulled out a thin file and placed it next to Dan's stack without opening it or explaining. His voice was slow, each word deliberate. "I lifted you at the right moment, gave you a seat at the table, and if needed, I can bring you down again. No scandal, no press, no questions asked." Dan didn't flinch. He looked at the file, then stood. "Then do it," he replied. "But if I fall, you'll fall with me, because this time, someone is recording your every move." He stepped out into the long hallway, the deep green carpet muffling his footsteps. Light from the windows sliced across his shoulders, cutting through the shadows behind him. No longer the junior officer who once revered his superior, he now walked with the clarity of someone who understood the battlefield and owed no one in this war. Inside, Callan remained motionless, his tea-long cold beside him. The wide office was bathed in soft light from large windows, casting a glow on the wall of medals and commendations. Each frame gleamed from careful polishing, reflecting the legacy Callan had spent years building. On his desk, copies of Holbrook's notes fanned out, the crooked handwriting and cryptic symbols stabbing into the foundation of stability he so proudly maintained. No family photos, no personal color, only the cold presence of power and principle. Callan sat still, fingers turning pages with restrained control. He didn't look at Dan, but his voice carried clearly. "What you and Agent Carter are doing could destabilize everything." Dan didn't answer, arms folded, eyes locked on every minor movement across the desk. Callan finally looked up, eyes fixed on Dan. "This system isn't perfect, but it works. However flawed, it keeps order. You want to change? Fine, but every change comes with a price." His voice wasn't raised, but the weight of it filled the airtight room. "You think justice is a straight line. It's actually a circle, one someone's already cut the corners from." He tapped lightly on Holbrook's notes. "Your father thought like you. He tried to bring internal files to light. I tried to hold him back, not because he was wrong, but because he was too right and far too alone." Dan frowned, his heartbeat catching for a second. He had never heard this from someone who was actually there. Callan continued, steady and deliberate. "He was forced out, Dan. Not for being wrong, but for shaking the system. That's what happens when you pierce the shell. Now you're repeating the cycle. But this time, no one will catch you like I once caught him." He laced his fingers and leaned forward, his expression tightening. "You think you're cleaning house, but what you're doing is tearing at the ceiling of an entire structure, and the ceiling could collapse on you before anyone sees what's rotting above." He paused, voice dropping but striking the air with clarity. "Every system has a threshold, and you are pushing it." Dan didn't back down. He pulled a thick printout from his briefcase, flipped to the final page and pointed to the last line. Callan's name appeared under the list of those authorized to approve transfers in internal complaint cases. Dan laid the document flat, voice steady and sharp. Then if it collapses, at least people will know where the rot began. Callan said nothing. His eyes rested on the page, where his name stood like a stain that couldn't be scrubbed away. Dan turned and left. The door closed quietly behind him, but the air in the room felt suddenly stripped of oxygen. Callan sat motionless, gaze drifting from the paper to the narrow beam of late afternoon light slicing across the floor. His fingers tapped the desk in short, steady beats. Then he picked up the office phone, dialing a number by heart. When the line connected, his voice was calm. He won't back down. Pressure may need to come from the outside. The call ended quickly. Callan leaned back in his chair, hands behind his head. The room remained silent, but its shadow had just stretched one step farther. The hearing room was windowless, sealed off from natural light, and the cold fluorescent lamps cast a dull gray over the long wooden table. All 12 seats were occupied. The disciplinary council sat motionless, faces unreadable. To the left sat the representative from Internal Affairs. Across from them, Morton sat upright, his navy blue suit pressed without a single wrinkle. Next to him was Walter Drayton, a seasoned attorney known for overturning cases based on claims of reverse bias against police officers. Drayton tapped a finger lightly on the tabletop when invited to speak. His voice was steady, nearly smooth, devoid of emotion. He did not deny that Morton drew his weapon. Instead, he reframed the narrative as a matter of threat identification in a high-risk zone, arguing that Morton reacted within a context of uncertainty. My client was not informed of the individual's identity. The man was not in uniform, refused to comply, and kept his hand near his jacket, he emphasized, then paused. I asked the counsel, in that moment, which of you could be certain he wasn't about to pull something dangerous? Drayton quickly shifted course. He questioned Malchus's behavior that day, suggesting that instead of following standard safety protocol, Malchus had created an ambiguous stance that escalated the situation. Why would a seasoned federal agent not identify himself immediately? Why refuse a direct order to lower his hands? And why choose provocation through eye contact instead of diffusing tension? The last question hung slowly in the thick air of polarization. Malchus sat still on the other side of the table. His gaze didn't move, but his breathing had changed. Dan sensed it, even though his friend never turned his head. Drayton went on. He revisited an old FBI file, citing an internal investigation from 5 years ago involving a mission Malchus had conducted, though the case had been closed with no violations found. We're not saying Agent Carter was wrong. We're asking, does he always follow the same standards he demands from others? A few members of the council took notes. Others folded their arms without expression. Drayton paused briefly, then delivered the final blow with practiced political sharpness. This incident is being exploited. While the department is under pressure to reform, someone has chosen this moment to turn a standard response into a symbolic attack on law enforcement. Morton remained silent beside him, his face unmoved since the session began. Malchus glanced at Dan. No words were exchanged, but the look between them made it clear that what was happening had gone far beyond a debate over whether a gun was drawn. This was a battle to redefine values, and the opposition was wielding every tool sharpened by years of trial and error. As the session drew to a close, Drayton leaned back and submitted a new request to the council. We move to summon a witness involved in a case 5 years ago under Agent Carter's oversight, an individual allegedly impacted by his investigative methods. Several members exchanged glances. The request was officially recorded. Dan leaned toward Malchus, voice lowered near his ear. They're going to dig deep. The question is, are you ready to uncover every layer of yourself? Malchus didn't turn his head. His eyes remained forward, but the answer was already in the silence. What the other side was preparing wasn't just a hearing. It was a trial of conviction. And they weren't carrying weapons. They were armed with satrate. The closed room was lit early, but no one spoke. The chairs were arranged in two opposing rows, files neatly stacked on the table, names printed in bold on small plastic placards. The atmosphere no longer felt merely procedural. It carried the weight of a place about to witness a shift, if someone dared to initiate it. Malchus was granted the floor in the second session. No lawyer beside him, no grand speech, just a folded note in his hand. He stood, voice low, composed, without raising volume. Everyone listened, because this time the matter wasn't about a tactical error, but about two conflicting visions of justice. He didn't begin by defending himself. He recounted the incident in sequence, each step clearly aligned with unaltered camera footage. When he reached the moment Morton pulled his gun, he made no emotional appeal. He simply let the words expose the absurdity. I didn't yell. I didn't resist. I raised my hands, and I had a gun pointed at my head. He paused. I've seen that scene in training sessions, simulating terrorist apprehensions. I didn't think I'd be in that position in real life, in broad daylight, outside a supermarket. One council member tapped a pen against the table. Another leaned toward Malchus, unblinking. No one interrupted. Malchus continued, this time not about himself, but about how the system allowed such incidents to repeat. He cited statistics on wrongful firearm draws within a 30-mile radius over the past 2 years, all victims unarmed, all people of color. The records were laid out before each member, not as numbers, but as names, addresses, and contextual details. We react when someone wears a hoodie, when someone walks strangely, when someone laughs at the wrong time, and we justify it with the word suspicion. But what we really fear isn't behavior, it's skin color, and those who don't see that are choosing to turn away from the truth. A thin, silver-haired member of the council leaned forward. You're making this about race. Malchus looked at him, head unbowed. I'm not making anything. I'm stating what it has always been, and if someone finds that uncomfortable, perhaps the discomfort is proof that it's real. The room fell into a silence so dense that no air conditioner could dissipate it. Dan sat in the back, hands clasped, eyes not focused on anyone, but on the middle of the table where nothing but emptiness lay. Malchus pulled a photo from his folder. A middle-aged man, kneeling, hands raised, mouth bloodied, a case of mistaken weapon draw labeled "Protocol followed." I know they can dig up every case I've worked. I know someone might say I once acted wrongly. I'm human, not immune to error. But if I had been shot that day, none of you would be here to hear me speak. And if I stay silent today, no one will ever hear about the people shot tomorrow. A council member asked quietly, "Do you believe Morton should lose his job over this?" Malchus didn't answer immediately. He looked around the room, then spoke slowly. If he could point a gun at me and feel nothing wrong, then the real question is, how many others has he drawn on that you never heard about? He folded his files, nodded in respect. Before sitting down, he placed a thin folder before the council chair. The cover read clearly, "List of victims over the past 2 years without disciplinary review. Low-level warnings. Permanent harm." Without raising his voice, Malchus stepped away from the center of the room, and for the first time, no one on the council wrote anything in their notes. They looked at each other, not to question, but to confirm that something had just shifted beyond anyone's control. The news that Lisa was being followed, even in a secure zone, made it clear to Maya that this was no longer about suppressing a scandal. It was about silencing a witness. She locked her laptop, pulled a hard drive from her safe, and reviewed its contents one last time. The recorded conversation between Morton and his former superior, raw surveillance footage, a retired officer's journal, Lisa's handwritten letter, and a short video of Dan in a tense meeting with his superior. Sending it through internal channels was out of the question. Instead, Maya contacted a former collaborator from the Federal Police Conduct Oversight Committee. Though not close, she trusted his integrity. After confirming the line was active, she used an encrypted connection to transfer the files. Just as the upload began, a warning appeared. Unauthorized access detected. no IP trace. Maya disconnected everything, shut down the system, grabbed the drive, and left through the fire escape. At a public cafe with a less traceable network, she resumed the transfer using independent software. The screen finally displayed, "Upload complete." Moments later, her inbox received a short reply. "Received. This now falls under federal jurisdiction." Maya exhaled for the first time in days. Not out of relief, but because retreat was no longer possible. That night, she changed her SIM, shut off all devices, and relocated to a temporary safe house arranged by Malkus. Before leaving her apartment, she left a sealed envelope with her lawyer, containing printed copies of the files, her sworn statement, and a handwritten note. "If I disappear, read this out loud." It wasn't about heroism, it was the only option left. Meanwhile, Dan Carter received a message from a contact inside federal oversight. "We've received a file from a journalist. It matches the events on your end. Prepare for a higher-level discussion." Dan remained still, staring out at the flickering streetlights. The matter had gone beyond internal lines. He knew, once the feds stepped in, everything would escalate. The federal hearing room was unlike anything familiar. No press, no recordings, only a long table, neutral faces, and the seal of the Federal Oversight Committee. When Malkus Carter was called, he entered not as a victim, but as a witness. He brought a thick file containing Maya's data, full timestamps, and photos outlining the systemic pattern. He said nothing about the gun pointed at his head. Instead, he focused on how Morton's actions reflected a culture that rewarded instinctive aggression and camouflaged bias under a badge. As Malkus outlined a timeline of incidents tied to Morton, the panel began taking heavier notes. A map appeared, linking seemingly unrelated cases. A young black man illegally searched, a Latino teen's broken arm after a stop for riding without lights, the suspicious death of a black veteran on his porch. When asked who helped obtain the files, Malkus named Maya, confirming everything was done legal. Then he paused. "Without Dan Carter, I wouldn't be here," he said. Pressed to elaborate, he described how Dan had retrieved a tampered video, moved Lisa to a safe location outside official protection, and kept it off the books. Dan wasn't neutral. He intervened to protect evidence, shield a witness, and force the system to face itself. One panelist asked whether there was proof that Morton's actions were systemic, not just personal. Malkus presented an internal email from a former tech staffer instructing leaders to go easy on strong-tempered personnel with stable ties in the Rapid Response Unit. It was signed by a now-retired senior official. Malkus closed his folder. This system didn't create racism, but it decided who got in, who got a weapon, and who lived in fear of it. No applause followed. This wasn't a courtroom for sentiment. But as he exited, a clerk quietly handed him a schedule. "Hold this date, we'll need you back." He nodded, saying nothing. He understood now. The story was no longer about a bullet that missed, it was about the system that had allowed it to be chambered. Maya quietly reread the anonymous email. "I know what you're looking for. Meet me." No recording. Below was a location nearly an hour outside the city. She printed it and brought it to Malkus, who was reviewing data from the drive Lisa once secured. Without question, he called the federal prosecutor in charge of witness protection. They agreed not to inform the commission, not to carry signal devices, and not to share their route. The meeting took place at a rundown diner by an old federal checkpoint. A man in a low-brimmed cap arrived and showed them an old ID, Technician Internal Archival System. Maya verified the serial number. He had worked 7 years in internal data maintenance, with access to flagged personnel files. According to him, the recruitment system wasn't neutral. Algorithms were manually altered. Applicants labeled unpredictable were quietly removed, while others with past violations were pushed into priority tracks. Morton was one of them. He had been fired for refusing to delete a set of emails that exposed racial filtering during intake. Since then, he'd been unable to find work. Everywhere he applied, his flagged profile showed up. "I'm speaking now not because I think I'll survive, but because if I disappear, someone needs to be held responsible." Before leaving, he placed a small hard drive on the table. Inside are unaltered records, including the internal directory that sorted candidates by racial compatibility level. He asked for no protection, just silence as he exited the life he once served. Back at the safe house, Maya and Malchus connected the drive. A hidden folder appeared after 2 layers of encryption. Inside was a long spreadsheet with strange tags. Too soft, unclear response, loyalty weak, not suited for armed environments. Morton was listed as priority for tactical trial, with attached internal correspondence. Needs someone who can choose targets. Disruptive instincts, easy to steer. No mention of previous complaints or violent conduct. Another sheet showed transfers of officers labeled not firm enough, despite no technical violations. Dan Carter's name was listed. He'd once been nominated for the Internal Strategic Review Group, but declined. Below was a note. Declined, responded negatively. Flag this. Malchus understood. Dan hadn't just been honest. He had been invited into the system and chose not to join. What was Morton to your people? Malchus asked. The man replied without hesitation, obedient enough not to ask questions, aggressive enough to be useful, and dumb enough to take the fall when it all collapsed. The sentence landed like a full stop at the end of a long denial. Morton wasn't an accident. He was the result of design. The 6th floor conference room was locked tight from the outside. Media personnel were barred from approaching. On the long tables, stamped reports had been delivered to each senior council member 3 days prior. The Federal Oversight Committee's findings, a formal recommendation from the Special Investigation Team, certified testimony from the tech witness, and an unreleased training video involving Morton. Logically, there was nothing left to review, yet the room remained silent. No one voiced support for Morton's dismissal. One member, once outspoken, called for additional review, citing the sensitivity of timing. Another referenced influence from non-administrative levels, hinting at external pressure. Every comment was a retreat, exposing the quiet force pressing down from higher places. Dan watched closely, recognizing the sidelong glance from someone who had once called him a reformer. He knew the shift wasn't due to logic, but to brief, powerful conversations behind closed doors, promises of protection in exchange for silence. Ballots were distributed. Maya stood beside Malchus, holding a notebook containing decrypted data they had spent weeks retrieving and verifying. She understood they weren't just confronting Morton anymore, but a system that instinctively shielded its own flaws. A staffer leaned into Dan, whispering, "The vote is leaning toward suspension." Dan remained still. The result was all but certain. Malchus rose without being invited. The room quieted as he stepped forward, voice steady and clear. He didn't quote files or mention evidence. He spoke about the moment Lisa was rescued, sitting on a cold concrete floor, too weak to cry, looking at him with empty eyes. In that gaze was a question. If it isn't me next time, who will speak up? Unexpectedly, a council member raised his hand, requesting the vote be paused to review an unofficial document. All eyes turned as the council secretary approached with a sealed envelope, scribbled on the outside in uneven handwriting, "Only open when silence takes over." The room fell still. The letter was opened with a silver blade. No title, no signature, only a raw confession. "My name is Lisa Torres, a security guard at Hapicole Supermarket on the day of the incident involving Officer Nathan Morton." The secretary read aloud, voice unwavering, each word slicing through the still air. "I saw Morton pull a gun on a black man he didn't know. No verification, no command, no legal cause. Just prejudice." Lisa described being told to keep quiet. Her shifts changed, being followed, and eventually fleeing the city, but she remembered everything. What Morton did wasn't an isolated act. "I heard him laugh as Malchus was handcuffed. Despite the lack of evidence, I saw his eyes. He knew no one would stop him." Near the end, she wrote, "I am not a hero. I stayed silent out of fear. But if Morton remains, remove my name from the list of respected employees. I cannot work under the same system as that man." There were no rebuttals. Someone called for a revote. This time, no one objected. Ballots were redistributed. No one left their seat. Within 10 minutes, the outcome was announced. Morton was permanently dismissed, with no appeal and no further review. A copy of Lisa's letter remained on the table. At the bottom, no signature, just 3 words in red capital letters. "I saw it." No one in the room could deny that someone had truly seen, and because she spoke, the truth could no longer be folded away. The morning after the meeting ended with Lisa's letter, Dan Carter called an urgent internal briefing at the command office. No press, no communications advisors, no preambles. He sat down with the head of personnel, oversight, and legal counsel, placing 3 printed files from the data Maya had sent the day before. No one questioned their presence. Everyone understood. The long silence was being broken, and anyone still clinging to it would soon face consequences. Dan ordered a full review of internal transfers, promotions, and altered or delayed disciplinary actions from the past 5 years, especially those tied to the phrase lacking soft ethical standards, a coded reference for individuals seen as hardline, reactive, and easy to manage in sensitive situations. It was the key he had once been offered as deputy chief, and the same one he had refused. After 2 days of cross-checking, 3 names stood out repeatedly in coordination records. One was a former deputy director of internal affairs, retired 3 months ago, who had suggested field testing Morton. The other 2 were regional commanders who had approved skipping Morton's initial warning and labeled him fit for tactical response. All matched evidence from the hard drive was provided by a tech witness. Dan didn't hesitate. He issued an internal order suspending all administrative collaboration with the 3, even if they were no longer active. All decisions they had signed in the past 3 years would be re-reviewed. Some departments pushed back, calling the move a purge. Whispers spread through the halls, accusing him of dividing the force. He responded with a memo to mid-level command. Stability rooted in avoidance is not worth preserving. We don't need artificial unity to cover up misconduct. What we need is a system that knows the difference between discipline and protection. He then halted all personnel evaluations based on the old model. All units were instructed to pause the use of vague behavioral tools and begin reviewing all feedback records from the team level upward. In his new model, every citizen complaint, verified or not, had to be logged with an ID code and could not be erased unless an investigation ruled otherwise. A quiet wave of support came from younger officers. Dan's memo was passed around like a declaration. No one would be allowed to stand outside the reform. With this move, he severed the very pipeline that had once produced another Morton. And he knew change didn't start with explosions, but with the quiet unlocking of doors long kept shut. Within 2 weeks of Morton's dismissal and the sweeping review order, HR began receiving resignations. The first 2 submitted late in the day without listed reasons. By the end of the second week, there were 7, ranging from veteran captains to internal coordinators, all indirectly tied to Morton documents or personnel complaints. Each file was a sign. Together, they formed a chain reaction from a single spark. Most striking was the resignation letter from Captain Robert Greeley, who had led the Northeast Division for nearly 15 years. "Maybe I've changed," he wrote, "or maybe the things I once ignored, thinking they were harmless, were the seeds that led us off course." The letter, meant to be private, leaked, appearing on a retired officers' forum, and then spreading to mainstream media. Reactions split. Some called it a dignified exit. Others saw it as walking away from accountability. At headquarters, the mood shifted. In tactical units, younger officers began discussing reform openly. Someone wrote on the meeting room board, "Cleansing is not division. It's how a living body heals." The phrase spread between teams, photographed and shared as a quiet signal that change was real. No one knew who wrote it first, but those backing Dan no longer felt alone. Meanwhile, the conservative bloc grew silent. They avoided debates, dodged any mention of Morton or Holbrook. To Dan, that silence was progress, not a win, but proof that the system was finally unsettled by questions it had long ignored. The media shifted too. A local paper that once questioned Dan now wrote, "A system learning to heal instead of hiding its wounds." A TV station invited him to appear in a live discussion, "Reform from Within." He declined, but sent a brief recording. Justice doesn't begin with speeches. It begins when someone accepts responsibility, even when no one demands it. Elsewhere in the city, Maya and Malchus sat quietly in a second-floor cafe. On screen, an editorial titled, "We Once Knew But Stayed Silent." Maya leaned in, read a line, then looked at Malchus. "They didn't fall to a bullet," she said calmly. "They crumbled when a truth finally escaped the drawer." Malchus didn't speak. He nodded, his eyes softening. For the first time in months, after prejudice, weapons, investigations, he allowed himself to smile. Not because it ended, but because, finally, it began in the right place. The room on the third floor of a temporary federal building was quiet, its thick walls sealing out sound, dim light falling across a scratched wooden table. Malchus Carter sat alone, eyes fixed on the document before him. His original report, written just after Morton drew his gun. The ink remained, but what haunted him now was not the words, but the space between them. He flipped to the final page and paused at the phrasing that said he had remained calm and acted as a federal agent. The words now felt empty. He opened his laptop and typed, "No longer writing as a representative." This time, he wrote what the reports never said, the truth of being held at gunpoint by someone sworn to uphold the law while being the law himself. He began, "The gun didn't kill me. Prejudice nearly killed my dignity." He described the moment Morton drew his weapon not as a tactical response, but a racial assumption. "If my skin were lighter, I might have been asked my name before being shouted at." The lines weren't angry. They were cold truths, carved from lived experience. He described the bystanders, phones raised, eyes stunned, no one speaking. "I'm not afraid of guns. I'm afraid of standing in a system that swallows reason and calls it reasonable suspicion." It wasn't a field incident. It was a survival between two versions of justice, one procedural, one poisoned. The final lines came sharp and short. "Had I moved half a second faster, I'd be a dead body, and he'd be cleared for following procedure." He submitted the report to the FBI and the Independent Review Board, sending copies to Dan and Maya. A leaked version soon circulated through internal networks. Its title, "Memo from a Survivor Without a Bullet." Malchus closed his laptop. One final sentence remained on screen. "We don't need more blood. We need memory and the will not to forget." At City Hall, every seat was filled. No banners, no slogans, just a white board. Integrity, commitment. Dan Carter stood at the podium. No notes, no introduction. He began, "I'm not here to debate right or wrong. I'm here because there's no way back." He recalled the supermarket parking lot, an officer aiming a gun at an unarmed federal agent. "Racism wears the mask of reasonable suspicion," he said, quoting Malchus. "The gun didn't kill me. Prejudice nearly killed my dignity." The room held its breath. When misconduct becomes familiar, we're not talking about individuals anymore, we're talking about structure. He then outlined 3 reforms: an independent oversight council, restructured recruitment and training, and public transparency of all complaints. "No one has the right to pull the trigger because of skin color," he said. "If the system allows it, the system must change, not the person facing the gun." At the back, Malchus watched silently. Maya sat beside him, recorder untouched. No applause, no chants, only a shared stillness. When Dan stepped off the podium, he walked straight to Malchus. They didn't speak, they didn't shake hands, just a look, a nod, and a mutual understanding. As the doors opened and light poured in, a young officer whispered to a colleague, "We're the ones who stayed, so let's do it differently." No reply came, but this silence, this time, was a beginning.